Africa. Kalle udu sihaye. Samayalo ipatela sabo pino.
Welcome to all our listeners. Welcome to the Cold War, Spectrum Auctions and African Political Stabilities episode of Ubuntunomics podcast. This month we look at the SA National Budget and Economic Recovery in 2022, the SA stance on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and the high demand frequency spectrum auction. And in the ECOWAS missions to Burkina Faso, Guinea and Mali, we also look at the Moroccan signing of the SAATM MOI, as well as the SADC post-election reviews in Angola and the DRC. And with me on this month's episode is Sbu Nyati from Isakombe Assets. Hello Sbu, how are you doing?
No, hi, Sia. I'm well, thank you, man. It's a great time to be alive. Interesting times, yeah.
Definitely. And with us this episode as well is Uzama Matungandaba from M&M Legal. Hi Zama, how are you?
Hi there, Sbu and Sia. I am good this month. I have missed you. Glad to be back on the show. How are you?
Very well,
Good.
Thank you. And as Sbu put it, it's a great time to be alive. Plea to all our listeners and a reminder for those who haven't subscribed on whatever platform you're listening through, please don't forget to subscribe so you get updated on our future episodes. And if you're enjoying this episode, hit the like button and share amongst your family and friends. And our first story in the SA update this month is the SA National Budget for 2022 and the economic recovery. So the Minister of Finance tabled the budget on the 23rd of February, and government is actually expecting to achieve a primary surplus by 2023, and that means that the revenue that government's able to accrue will exceed the non-interest payments or actual government expenditure excluding interest payments on its public debt. And the budget deficit for the current year is projected to be around 6% of GDP and narrowing to 4% by 2024. And one of the major concerns in this national budget was the rising public debt, obviously coming on the amount of borrowing that the government had to do in response to the COVID pandemic in 2022, and in a context of lower revenue because of lower economic activity. And government's debt is actually expected to stabilize at 75% of GDP by 2024. With debt servicing costs over this period from this year till 2024 averaging around 333 billion rand, and that's about 18% of government revenue. And the bulk of government's expenditure is 6.6 trillion over the MTEF going towards learning and culture, followed by social development and debt servicing costs at around 1 trillion rand each over this period. And government's expecting to achieve revenues over this period of 5.6 trillion. And even though this outlook is positive given the expected surplus, there's significant risks posed by the slowing economic activity, growing calls for social protection, and pressures on government spending to increase as the country tries to recover from the global pandemic that we faced about 2 years ago. Zama, you had an interesting question about this expectation of a surplus.
Yes, yeah. I'm just wondering, is it clear how the government expects to achieve this surplus?
This sounds like another of our country's famous summaries. We're good at analyzing problems, but not so good at implementing solutions. Now, fiscal consolidation, or sometimes called austerity, has not worked for South Africa. That has kept creeping up because there's no growth. It is only when there is rapid growth, especially in a case like South Africa's, that these expenditure items that you mentioned will only become discounted when there is growth. So the country has persisted with viewing a national budget in the same way household budgets are structured, wherein savings on expenses will result in a better financial position for that home. But now national budgets work differently. Growth is as a result of spending on growth items through increasing revenue volumes for the productive sectors of the economy, whether they are private or public. Now, a higher economic output in the equation results in a lower debt to GDP ratio. Basically, you concentrate on sustainable growth. Your focus must not be on maintaining these self-imposed debt ceiling levels. Now we're talking about 75%, and the magic number is said to be 90% now from the 80%. So these numbers are not the thing. Getting back to Zama's question, what is the use of attaining a surplus? When in the final analysis, this will mean you starve your private sector. Because according to Wynne Godley's theory of sectoral balances, a government surplus represents a government collecting more tax revenue than it pays in outlays, building its net financial position. I mean, a surplus will mean that the government is a net saver by removing funds from the economy through taxes or budget cuts. And these are removed from the private sector. So on the other hand, if you have a deficit balance, it means that government outlays are greater than the tax revenues collected. And this increases your debt position, providing funds to the private sector. I mean, at the SONA this last February, the president talked about a private sector-led growth model. But now, if you have these austerity measures, you're cutting out your private sector. So this proposal of a surplus is more nonsensical to me, considering that the National Treasury's projections for the medium term are averaging at something like 1.8%. So, and the World Bank and the IMF have forecast 1.5% growth between 2022 to 2026. And that will mean you will be adding 2.5 million more unemployed people onto the unemployment lines. So this means that it is estimated that by 2026, the country will have an expanded unemployment rate of about 50%, growing by 3% from the current 47%. So in the end, there will be no economic recovery here. But what will happen is that there'll be a reduction of GDP growth and an increase in debt ratios. So we must remember that when this fiscal consolidation started in 2014 and results started in around about 2016, results started showing, we had a debt to GDP ratio of about 47%. So that has kept on increasing all this while up to this current 75%. So what we have been doing since 2014, we've been doing the same thing and it has failed time and time again. Even our forecasts tell us that it will fail, but we keep on doing the same thing, cutting budgets and cutting the productive side of the economy, starving the private sector. Anyway, yeah, I hope that answers your question, Sam.
Yeah, so I think, look, in a nutshell, I think Sbu's highlighting the fact that, unlike households, and I think households are functioning in a similar but microcosm way, but also very different from public financing, that in order to achieve a surplus, you either reduce your spending or increase your income, right? But in the space of government, it's not as simple as either increasing your savings or getting a new job that increases your income. In government, it also matters what government spends on. So unlike an individual household or individual who's mainly consuming their income on upkeep, and to some extent also investing, etc., the government, all of its expenditure partly needs to cushion some part of the society which is under economic deprivation, and also invest in things that are going to generate economic growth. I think what's crucial for governments is to understand how to achieve growth and how to support growth in the economy, because that is a primary way in which governments pay their debts. Typically, governments grow out of their debts, and as you grow your economy, the actual value and size of your debt becomes negligible and less onerous on government spending. And so if you've got a slow growing economy like South Africa, it's terrible to mainly just cut spending. What you want to do is spend on high growth items, because that will alleviate the burden of debt. Because you'll be growing your economy, the actual debt servicing costs as a share of government revenue starts diminishing as well. And so that debt becomes less onerous on the government and the society.
Definitely. Yes, no, 100%. And I think, this is the reason that I haven't really had such a positive outlook on South Africa's budget and national recovery, because, even when looking at what has been, how we're planning on spending the money, it's saying learning and culture. I understand learning, but that is a very long-term view. And when we're talking social development, how is this actually going to improve the other aspects that are quite onerous on our economy, including our slow economic growth rates and these calls for more social protection and the public service wage bill. So all of these things to me show that, our expectations are actually overly optimistic, because we're fighting really, really big risks. And I think 2 years is a short time. We're already at the end of Q1 of 2022, meaning these expectations are only relevant for the next 18 months. And I think we're just really, really being optimistic about, where we see us going. And I think, are you guys agreeing with me that we are optimistic? And just one final comment is that I think generally the government doesn't market itself and its programs well in South Africa. So I think this is another reason why we're slow to progress as well, right? I just think that there is a certain culture of elitism and closed doors when it comes to, benefiting from government programs, which I think is absolute nonsense. So I'm not saying this does not excuse any apathy from, youth or private, private enterprise, but I honestly think that we need to widen the scope of people who have access to an actual real opportunity to gain from government programs.
I definitely agree with you there, Zam. And I think this is where now the rubber hits the tarmac when it comes to public finance, because on the one hand, the financing just, determines where the resources are going. But the other part of the whole story is actual policy. And if your policies are not good, or they're not actually aligned to create development and their own goals, it doesn't matter what you allocate those resources to, they're not going to achieve the intended outcomes. Take learning and culture, for example. It doesn't matter how much more money government wants to spend in recruiting teachers and even perhaps to some extent improving the quality of public education, if things like the pass rate is still 33%, or the actual outcomes that are going to come out of that system are not actually going to be geared towards generating development and economic growth in the economy. And this is where now the policies become crucial as well. And with that policy space also is the issue you're raising around, how does government manage its engagement with the citizenship? And, the best way is going to need to be transparency and equal access for all people, and obviously emphasizing support to those who are most marginalized and most vulnerable in our society.
I see. We're talking about learning and culture because both of you touched on this, and you say in your opening statement that this is where the bulk of the total government expenditure goes to. I also think that the private sector is sort of like resting on their laurels when it comes to learning and culture. I mean, when I came out of higher education, I didn't have the skills. The skills I only learned when I went for experiential training, and then I picked up more skills when I started working full time. So in the old days, and even in other countries, the private sector steps in, and because it's the private sector that polishes these graduates. I mean, we came out. We've spent so much money with things like all of these SITAs. That's government money, but the private sector was, on the other hand, has just been on the receiving end, not playing their part. So I think that to solve this, especially the unemployment problem in South Africa, the private sector needs to step in and do their part, skill people, because getting a degree is one thing, but skilling is something else. I mean, even for low-end skills, we need a private sector or the manufacturing sector or whatever, all of these sectors to skill people. I mean, this used to be done by all of the Anglo-Americans back in the day. People went into the mines and they got skilled in the mines. They got skilled at Transnet and they got skilled in all of these SOEs and the private sector, the mining companies that we had. So we need to maybe cut on a bit on that, because we're not getting the returns on the country's investment. Yeah.
Sure, definitely agree. I think on that note, let's move on to our next story on the SA stance on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So the President Cyril Ramaphosa clarified the SA stance on the Ukraine-Russia conflict by emphasizing the principle that members should refrain from the threat or use of force against territorial integrity or political independence of other states. And South Africa has made a commitment to the United Nations Charter, including the principle that all member countries are expected to settle any international disputes through peaceful means and dialogue. So essentially, South Africa supports a meaningful dialogue towards lasting peace in order to ensure the security and stability of all countries. And whilst South Africa understands the causes of the conflict, it cannot condone the use of force or violation of international law. But South Africa also recognizes that coercive measures through sanctions and which are outside the legal prescripts of the United Nations may actually intensify or prolong the conflict.
I was very worried in the beginning when DIRCO issued a statement not in line with the country's international policy, that policy of non-alignment. It was a good thing that the country corrected that mistake and setting our response to be in line with our BRICS partners. I mean, we cannot run away from the fact that there are global blocks and spheres of influence. Even though South Africa gets invited to G7 summits to represent the continent, and we are part of the G20, the truth is that we are still a developing country. Our struggles and our visions are similar to those of our peers as we look to increase trade and all of those mutual benefits that we're supposed to get. So South Africa has always canvassed for UN reforms, and we must be perturbed by the unequal treatment of members of the UN by most of these UN bodies. I mean, top of mind, is how the IMF and the World Bank jumped in to finance the one party to the conflict, first with a 700 million loan, which will be followed up by a 3.5 billion dollar loan. But these things never happened when Ethiopia was at war. The same thing never happened in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in South Sudan, in Libya and Syria. But now you get Europeans involved, the World Bank jumps in and the IMF jump in and they take sides. So the conflict in Ukraine is actually on two fronts. There's the military aspect of it, and then there's the economic. Unfortunately, countries in the global south will most likely be the worst impacted because supply side constraints will tighten. Inflation is increasing and foreign direct investments will dry up. Then there are also other considerations like commodity price increments, especially agricultural inputs and consumables like wheat, and there's the bigger fear of energy costs, and this will hurt us. And we're not part of that conflict, but anyway, yeah, that's just my bit on this Ukraine story.
Yeah, look, I definitely agree with you there, Sbu. We seem to be faced with another Cold War all over again, and we need to, African countries are going to be forced at some point to pick sides. And, if this thing escalates and intensifies and it draws in other parties, like currently it's the European countries trying to assist Ukraine with the help of the United States, basically the banding together of the West. And if now on the Russian side, China and other countries are forced to be on the side of Russia for political and other reasons, or at least to choose a side, even though China's trying to play the mediator middle road. If this thing intensifies, I think China will also be forced to pick a side. And so it seems to me that we're back in the late 1960s and 1970s in the Cold War again. And it's quite concerning. And the challenge is that, for African countries, this could spell crisis, or it could also spell, commodities boom that needs to be taken advantage of. Unfortunately, though, in terms of food security, the critical resources such as, wheat, grains, come from the region. Around 40 to 50% of global, wheat supply comes from those two countries. And so we will feel a definite impact on food prices as well as fuel, as you rightfully, highlight, given the importance of Russia to global oil supply. But at the same time, this is a good time for our oil exporters on the continent, in as much as it's a bad time for everybody, given the fact that, fueling prices increase will always work their way through to the price of food and general consumption goods in the economies of African countries in any case. Zama?
On the point of, South Africa saying that members should refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of other states. I think this is quite interesting because this is a sort of a theme in the global sort of space, to say that, this is kind of the reason why certain conflicts are actually arising. Like in this instance, I think in this war, Russia actually sees Ukraine as part of its states or its military allegiance, which basically, is using to say that, it's more than within its rights to do whatever it's doing. And, particularly considering factors at play, such as proximity of the countries, then, I really think these issues start to become very, very, very tricky, especially with the issue of territorial integrity and political independence.
Yeah, definitely. And, ironically, the same sort of conflict is happening in different dimensions, throughout the globe. If you think of, the Russia-Ukraine conflict being pretty much similar to what China had in the instance of Hong Kong as well as Taiwan currently. And I don't know if I'm to speculate about how this war is going to turn out. If this war intensifies, I do think that China is going to end up having to choose a side and may choose to be on the side of Russia. And, at that point, we don't know where things might end, but definitely it seems as though it's that. And I don't want to paint a picture of World War III, so to speak, but it'll definitely be a repeat of the Cold War, with each side sort of going to the brink and seeing where things go. But I do hope that this thing is resolved very urgently or within a couple of years' time, because it seems as though globally we're just moving from one crisis to the next.
Yeah, the last point, maybe we'll touch on this in the next episode. If this war continues, will be the economic ramifications on Russia and the change. There is a global shift because Russia has been kicked out of the SWIFT banking system, and there is the Chinese system that they will be using, and there is India on this other hand will be buying oil in Russian rubles or in their own currency. So there is this bit about moving away from the petrodollar to using other currencies and having other systems, other financial systems. But this is a developing story, so maybe we'll touch upon it in our next installment. But it's just very interesting, the economic dynamics of it all.
Yeah, we're definitely faced with major geopolitical shifts, and yeah, it's just very interesting times to be alive. On that note, let's take it to the last story on the SA update on the ICASA concluding its spectrum auction. This was done on the 17th of March, and the auction comprised mainly of the top 6 bidders who are telco companies in South Africa, including Cell C, Liquid Intelligent Technologies, MTN, Rain Networks, Telkom, and Vodacom. And the government was able to raise 14 billion through these auctions, which allocated spectrum to these bidders for the next 20 years. Zama?
So I have a bit of a question around, okay, now they have raised a total of 14.4 billion through these auctions. I just wondered how these proceeds get invested. Do they, sort of get dumped into a global pool of funds, that is relevant for our revenue, as we spoke about our sort of, recovery and, GDP revenue 2 stories ago? Is it that kind of thing? Or, does it maybe get reallocated into the communications budgets, for other projects internally within the department? Or would you say this 14.4 billion is, it's pretty much the same thing because, they would have been given budgets beforehand on what, amounts they're going to be using for the next, 5 years? I was just wondering, what are the implications of this money that they raised? And just another interesting question, just out of thought, that in the government, would there be any performance bonuses for meeting KPIs? So if they had said they are aiming to, make 10 million or 10 billion from these auctions, and now they've blown the lights out, do people get any, recognition, through the form of performance bonuses or any other sort of, thing like that? Just the question.
Yeah. Look, you can rest assured that there's some political heads who want to take glory and claim this as a victory that they pushed, especially those who they fall in the portfolio of communications, digital, and I forget the full department now. But yeah, there are people who are going to claim and will be expecting a nice bonus as a result of this. Where does the money go? It goes to the National Revenue Fund. And just in terms of its relative impact, it's important to note that this is just a little under 1% of government revenue. Government revenue is around 1.4 to about 1.5 trillion rand currently. and it's about 14 billion of that is about less than 1%. So in relative terms, it's not a lot, but obviously all pennies count. Smoo?
I'll tell you what I found interesting was that all parties went away satisfied. The government got more than they had anticipated. I think they thought the figure was around about 8 billion. I think that's what we said in the last story. And the bidders also thought the packages were good value for money. So I just wonder why it took them 6 days, though, to complete the entire process. Otherwise, this was a very welcome development, especially with the bid with that bid qualification about free data that the government had put in. I mean, if all parties are satisfied, I suppose it is a very good development.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's much needed, particularly in the sort of post-COVID and work from home environment where, connectivity and access to high-speed broadband is going to be crucial in driving, again, economic growth and recovery for the country. On that note, that takes us to the upcoming developments for South Africa. And on the 24th of March, South Africa is hosting the South Africa Investment Conference. And on the 11th of April, expecting a data releases on manufacturing, followed by the 14th of April for mining. And on the 20th, it'll be March 2022, CPI numbers being released by Stats SA. And on that note, it's another time for a reminder to our listeners to hit the subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening through. And if you're enjoying this month's episode, hit the like button and share it amongst your family and friends. On that note, that takes us to the Africa update for this month. And our first story in the Africa update is the ECOWAS missions to Burkina Faso, Guinea and Mali. So the heads of state and government for the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, deployed new missions and strengthened existing missions to support stabilization in the three countries. In the case of Burkina Faso, the visit by President of Ghana as the chairman of ECOWAS and President of Niger was cancelled after the adoption of the transitional charter, which allows the military junta that seized power in January to lead the transition over the next 3 years towards constitutional rule. In the case of Guinea, the transitional authorities failed to meet the ECOWAS 6-month deadline for return to constitutional rule after the military junta's coup in September of 2021. Whilst in Mali, the ECOWAS delegation led by His Excellency Goodluck Jonathan failed to meet any further progress in their negotiations on a timetable for elections and the return to constitutional rule. Zama, what are your thoughts on this one?
I think we're definitely seeing positive developments in the sense that, I would really hope to see proper stabilization of these regions by the end of 2022. Moving into 2023, the ones that are not looking so good right now. And yeah, I think we just have to begin to stabilize the entire African continent. And then I think that it is prudent that constitutional transitions be encouraged in order to facilitate peace. However, I think that it's important that the countries in question are assisted in managing, free and fair elections, coming up. So when looking specifically at the case of, for example, Burkina Faso, where the visit of the president of Niger was cancelled because there was an adoption of a transitional charter. I think, that's, it's that, for example, for me seems a little bit dodgy in the sense that just because now they've said, okay, no, we're going to adopt a 3-year transitional period, so this meeting is not necessary. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think that it should still actually had happened, for example, because it's important that a close eye should be kept to make sure that progress is being made in the African development as a whole. And I just want to make a point to say on the other two countries where we've seen that they failed to make progress in negotiations. I think that it is important to note for these countries that now with absolute power comes absolute responsibility. That's something that I think is quite a generally widely used phrase to say that these countries were taken over by means of coup. So they need to remember the voices of the people who led them to be in these positions, or whether they took it upon themselves to be in these positions. But they shouldn't forget to serve, those people who basically have now put their faith in them. So, leadership is an act of service. And I think that these coup leaders and military officials should really display these qualities boldly to their countrymen. And they cannot hide behind, now it's been over a year and it's been over 2 years and we're still not seeing any progress.
Zama, I still think that it is safe to say that the concept of and the definition of democracy, I think these are being redefined and getting a new interpretation in West Africa's Sahel region. You might remember that they are the Songhai Kingdom, the Kingdom of Ghana, and then you've got people from the Tuareg ethnic group, and then you've got the Fulani there. I think the intermingling of those people and their interactions, they are trying to, in a way, come up with a definition of democracy that suits all of them. I think that's one of the reasons why there's all of this turmoil in that region. But yeah.
Definitely think that also, as young states in the region and African countries overall, we are at a point where we are developing a lot of these political institutions along the way. We sort of building the plane as we flying and trying to board it. And so, a lot of the progress in our political maturity would definitely be outside of the lines. We're coloring all over the show. And that's the nature of statehood and development. And precisely what Sbu's highlighting in, the existence of statehood is really the result of the interaction between tradition, culture, as well as religion, and the way in which people live and produce both themselves, but economic production as well. So it's not always going to be fitting the predefined, existing systems, especially for young states that are still developing and also having not had the benefit of establishing the extent in terms of borders in a natural development that through the political progression of these states. A lot of these African countries are the result of the Berlin Conference and the European expansion in Africa, and so what people are left with really is having to develop in pre-confined spaces and having to deal with what they've been given, both in terms of natural resources as well as geographic specificities, which constrain their ability to move as and where they need to be according to their livelihoods needs and free development and move. And that's why issues such as the free movement of people is so crucial in the final piece that will allow Africa to develop in a more organic way. And on that note, that takes us to the next story on the Africa, a regional update on Morocco signing the SAATM MOI. So the Kingdom of Morocco signed the revised constitution of the Africa Civil Aviation Commission, the AFSAC, and the Single African Airline Transport Market, the SAATM Memorandum of Implementation. Currently, 35 African countries have joined the SAATM and have opened up their markets to each other, removing restrictions in terms of frequency, capacity, and granting to each other traffic rights. These countries, with a total population of 800 million, now account for 61% of the population of the continent, as well as 89% of intra-Africa air travel market. So the SAATM will enable intra-Africa transport connectivity and support improvements in terms of trade and tourism. And by signing the SAATM, the countries commit to revising their bilateral air service agreements with other African countries to make them compliant with the provisions of the Yamoussoukro decision, with the intention of full liberalization of air transport services. And that's really a positive development in my eyes. Smoo, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, you talk about 800 million people and 89% of intra-African air transport market. My worry is about the other African airlines which have not signed up to this SAATM Memorandum of Implementation. The big economies have joined the SAATM. One can only assume the impediment has to do with capacity, depending on others for services. I mean, I'm thinking of countries like Somalia who have not joined in, or South Sudan. You know, Africa is a colossal continent. The distances are big. So air travel and shipping should be obvious transportation modes for now, since we don't have good rail connecting all of these countries. So now this development is positive and will also result in positive gains in terms of air traffic flow patterns and volumes. And then there will be increased competition, which may drive prices down. There may be efficiency gains as a result of this industry liberalization. There could also be more strategic partnerships among African airlines. So this is good for the industry. My only question, though, would be, what does the SAATM say about foreign ownership? Because like in a case like South Africa, where we have the one airline, the one national airline which is being privatized, and we have other airlines operating from South Africa, like British Airways. Well, will we be opening up a space for them to all of these other international players who are competitors to African airlines?
Sure. Look, I think it is firstly important to note that so it's not necessarily the airlines that are signing on, it's actually the countries, the nation states. And I think for me, it's a case of it doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white as long as it catches the mice, right? And, by inclusion of foreign ownership or strategic partnerships with local airlines, and if that leads to further learnings or improvements in the operations and delivery of air travel services on the continent, that's a plus for me. But for me, crucially, what we need to note about this development are two things, and I like your summary of your points, that it's providing perhaps additional competition and some further efficiencies, but overall, as by definition, this will firstly lead to much cheaper air travel costs for African citizenry, mainly because of the removal of restrictions on air traffic rights across the continent. And that means that now, the whole continent's air traffic jurisdiction will operate as a single market, with each country having the same costs of at least traveling across the continent. What that means is that no longer will airlines be bound by their home ground advantage. So currently, for example, if you want to fly to West Africa from South Africa, you have limited number of options. SAA, I think, if they still do operate their flights to West Africa, is an option, but that was either expensive or non-operational for the past year and a half to 2 years, and so people are forced to either take Ethiopian Airlines, Rwandan Airline, or Rwanda, or Kenya Airways, and that means that before you go to West Africa, you have to travel to East Africa, either to Addis, Kigali, or Nairobi, and then connect to West Africa. And for the international airlines like Emirates, etc., you had to fly to Dubai or the Middle East in order to connect to West Africa, just mainly because countries or these airlines linked to the countries are taking advantage of the home ground advantage. Now what this means is that, the same airlines could travel directly to their destinations and stopping freely at any airport along the route in order to refuel, etc., as necessary. And there won't be this home ground advantage because the liberalization and the single airline market will significantly reduce things like disadvantages caused by ground handling costs, refueling costs, etc., which force airlines to go to their home ground advantage in order to reconnect to main destinations. So those, to me, are the two crucial, impacts and results of this agreement. And again, as I said, foreign ownership or not, to me, as long as the cat is catching the mice, African citizens will benefit from the much cheaper intracontinental travel, which I think is a crucial element in enabling the free human movement across the continent. Zama?
Yeah, no, definitely agree with you guys there. I think I'm really happy to see this, and I think it's a step in the right direction. Zama is saying introduce an African visa and cheaper prices on intra-Africa travel, because even in my own personal experience, I've seen that traveling in and around Africa has actually shown to be quite expensive, to the extent that you even think, I'd much rather pay for a trip to Dubai, a return flight to Dubai, than a return trip to, I don't know what I could say, like Angola, because it happened to be like around me, probably the same price. So I find myself wondering, how is it that traveling in Africa is expensive for Africans? I don't understand how this is the case. So I really think that we do need to make it easier for us to, operate across our countries, and similar to what we see in the Eurozone. So I think it's a really positive step.
I agree with you, Zama, 100%. And I think these liberalizations will be a crucial part of enabling the free movement of people and even the integration process on the continent. In as much as we've been good in supporting private sector growth and trade amongst each other through the Africa Continental Trade Agreement and investments in infrastructure that interconnect us, we haven't seen this direct impact on the general populace, and things like the freedom of movement have a direct impact and benefit for everyone across the continent. On that note, that brings us to the last story on the Africa update on the SADC post-election reviews in Angola and the DRC. The Southern African Development Community Electoral Advisory Council, SACEC, conducted post-election reviews aimed at assessing the implementation of recommendations of the SADC electoral observer missions and assessing the level of preparedness for elections in Angola in August 2022 and the Democratic Republic of Congo in late 2023. The SAEC mission to Angola paid a courtesy visit called to the Minister of External Relations on the 9th of March and held consultations with various stakeholders on the 10th of March. Whilst the SAEC mission to the DRC held consultations with the leadership of the National Independent Electoral Commission, CENI, of the DRC on the 15th of March, and the delegation is expected to hold further consultations with stakeholders that include political parties in government and the opposition. Zama, what are your thoughts on this one?
So when it comes to this aspect, I think that countries such as Angola are quite large, and I think that it is going to be a mission of mass scale in order to make sure that everyone has, one, access to a voting station. Then secondly, I think that much will have to be done about factors such as vote counting, and making sure that there are no issues at the voting stations. So it's going to be a mammoth task. That's what I have to say on this.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with you. And I think some of the observer mission results, particularly in the DRC, highlighted this issue of like a large geographic extent where some regions, obviously in the eastern parts of the DRC, where elections couldn't be held simply because of the level of violence and conflict taking place. And I think these will be crucial in order to ensure that we have an environment that's conducive to democratic institutions developing and democratic elections taking place. Smoo?
In Angola, it shall be very interesting to see how the second elections after the 38-year-long reign by Mr. Dos Santos, how these elections will go. I don't foresee any pronounced difficulties except for the usual cries by the opposition regarding violated processes. Hopefully, this problem will be resolved by the SAAC. The facilitation for voting by Angolans in the diaspora should be commended. That was a good move. Another factor that will come into play will be access to media coverage, because in the last elections of 2017, UNITA accused the PLA government of unfairly using state machinery for campaigning. And then in the DRC, those elections, as you guys have said, that country is massive, so there will be logistics and security concerns. It is also expected that more than 18 million voters will cast their ballots. So the last elections in 2018 were very controversial, if you remember. I hope the electoral reforms, as recommended by SADC, will in 2020. I mean, there was that SADC commission. I hope that those will bear fruit. Also, the local electoral commission, it needs to improve its performance. We will remember that they came under fierce scrutiny and they were criticized during the 2018 elections. International observers and the DRC Catholic Church observers were particularly displeased with their performance. Even one of the contenders, he famously remarked that where did Tshisekedi get all those 7 million votes? He didn't want to accept the results. So I hope things improve. Yeah.
Definitely agree with you. And I think that these are also crucial in maintaining the level of stability in the SADC region. And we will just have to keep an eye on the story and how it develops. On that note, that is the last story on the Africa Update, and that takes us to upcoming developments in Africa. As you know, March is the Human Rights and TB Awareness Month, and in April is Freedom Month in South Africa. And on the 4th to the 8th of April, the 4th session of the AU Technical Committee on Social Development, Labor and Employment is going to be held. And this takes us to the numbers game.
Okay, all right. Yeah.
So this month's number is plus 4.9% increase in 2021. So what do you guys think this number is related to?
I think I'll let Zama take this one. I mean, I'll give you a hint, Zama. It's got to do with that first story.
Yes.
Ooh.
Okay.
Ooh. Are you flexing? I see you.
I love it. Like I'm even getting helpful hints.
You must have hacked my emails on my computer or something. How are you so good at this? Anyway, go ahead, Zama. What's your guess?
Oh my gosh, guys! You see, even with helpful hints, like I don't even know what is this? Is it an increase in our, debt to GDP ratio, GDP to debt ratio? I don't know. What is it?
Close, but no cigar. Very close.
Yeah.
Smooth. No. I'll let you claim your victory. What is this number regarding?
No. The reason why when I spotted this number and I thought, we had a story about this last time. So this is the for the year of 2021. That is our growth, our GDP growth for the year. I think the estimate was about 5.2%, and then we came slightly lower at 4.9%. Am I right, Sia?
100%. Spot on, Spoo. I think you've got it. So that's South Africa's gross domestic product, GDP, which increased by 1.2% in the fourth quarter of 2021, with personal services increasing by 2.7%, contributing 0.4% towards GDP, whilst manufacturing, trade and accommodation, as well as agriculture, respectively increased by 2.8%, 2.9%, and 12.2%, each contributing 0.3% towards growth. And annually, real GDP increased by 4.9% in 2021, following a decrease of 6.4% in 2020. So there you have it, GDP increase of 4.9% in South Africa for 2021. And it must be said, though, that obviously these numbers are significantly affected by base effects, given that the 2020 numbers are severely affected by the global lockdown and the global pandemic, which resulted in a 6.4% reduction in GDP, and that coming off of that, we've increased by 4.9% in GDP in 2021.
Yeah, the number looks good, but as you're saying, the size of our economy is still less than we were back in 2019. So yeah.
Definitely. And on that note, that brings an end to our episode this month.
Go